Hello there, fuckaroos. It's like buckaroos, but for motherfuckers. I radio into you today from good old Merv, Murder RV, wanting to pick up with some concepts that I threw down in our Back to Basics episode that I recently put out. It crossed my mind nearly as soon as I was done recording that I had used some words that I think they're challenging for people. So, namely, I realized that I slipped up in a moment of searching for the correct vernacular, and I used the word mindful. We must learn to continually be mindful, or else we end up reliving and repeating the patterns that we were trained with. The other questionable word that I used being trained, which, as I noted in that episode, I assume is kind of a difficult word for a lot of us to hear because it comes with some negative, kind of animalistic connotations. But to go back to mindful and mindfulness, that is one of those pop cultured terms that has been overused and over Instagrammed to mean fucking nothing, right? Literally every kind of expert and advisor out there is going to tell you to be mindful. And it's become such a problem in recent years, probably the last decade or two even, that I have a paper saved somewhere in my archives from my master's program where this peer-reviewed article discussed the fact that nobody knew what mindfulness was anymore. It did not have a clear definition because it has been so overused and diluted. So therefore, it is a term that I generally try to avoid on the show in my attempt to not be some kind of toxically positive, overly simplistic, just yoga about it perspective on mental and physical health. That said, it seemed like a good idea to come in today and to better define mindfulness, as well as exactly what I'm talking about when I say training, and how those things are related, how one is the antidote to the other, and what it all really fucking means. So I've pulled up another paper. This one is called Effects of Mindfulness on Psychological Health, a Review of Empirical Studies. It is open source, so I can share that with everybody if you want to read through all of the benefits yourself. But the point here is, how do they define mindfulness? How do the psychologists who are trying to summarize and review what everyone else has said about mindfulness, how are they going to explain it to us? So they say, the elements of mindfulness, namely awareness and non-judgmental acceptance of one's moment-to-moment experience, are regarded as potentially effective antidotes against common forms of psychological distress, rumination, anxiety, worry, fear, anger, and so on. So you can see why all of this is heartily related to trauma and complex trauma, right? They just described our lives: rumination, anxiety, worry, fear, anger, and so on. Many of which involve the maladaptive tendencies to avoid, suppress, or over-engage with one's distressing thoughts and emotions. All right, so we've got some uncomfortable internal churnings going on, and the human brain tends to try to escape from it, to push it all down and just hope it goes away, or to really dig in and extrapolate upon the rumination, anxiety, worry, fear, anger, and so on. Am I right? This is where mindfulness becomes an absolutely necessary part of our recovery efforts. They continue trying to define this thing by saying, one of the most commonly cited definitions of mindfulness is the awareness that arises through, quote, paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. That part is very important because as soon as we are judging anything that is going on inside or outside of us, we're really not observing the thing anymore. We are, again, extrapolating, creating stories, or trying to fit things in line with the stories that we've already learned and accepted as our framework for the world, which means we're not purely observing anything. And we, in fact, are operating as if we are our brains, the information that we've accidentally absorbed into them, and the programs that we have accidentally created around those programs. And we lose the ability to instead control or guide our brains. And that is where a lot of us run into real problems with things that we call triggers, right? Or automatic reactions that are bone deep inside of us that we assume we have no way to manage. But we do. It's through mindfulness. It is through observation that we do not elucidate or expand into greater stories. Another definition includes the non-judgmental observation of the ongoing stream of internal and external stimuli as they arise. So again, being a neutral observer of both what's going on inside and outside, which is really part of reality testing, something that we've been talking about recently in the community with some of our I'd say higher level discussions of consciousness and the many intricacies of operating that thing responsibly, realistically. Now, here's one more definition for you from the experts, and then I'll tell you what my definition is. They say, the model of Bishop et al. Is very common, which propose that mindfulness encompasses two components: self-regulation of attention and adoption of a particular orientation towards one's experiences. Self-regulation of attention refers to non-elaborative observation and awareness of sensations, thoughts, or feelings from moment to moment. It requires both the ability to anchor one's attention on what is occurring and the ability to intentionally switch attention from one aspect of the experience to another. So that's where mindfulness gets really difficult for us with the attentional difficulties of ADHD, ADD, autism, and obsession, right? Intentionally switching attention. They go on to describe the orientation to experience, which is the other component of their definition. They say, orientation to experience concerns the kind of attitude that one holds towards one's experience, specifically an attitude of curiosity, openness, and acceptance. It is worth noting, and I agree, that acceptance in the context of mindfulness should not be equated with passivity or resignation. And I think that's just important to keep in mind with all of our discussions of PTSD and especially complex trauma. Acceptance is not learned helplessness or completely forfeiting control / giving up, right? Oftentimes, that is something that our brains will do in a self-defensive manner. And oftentimes, we also assume that that's what acceptance means, and then have a very negative reaction to the word acceptance when we are, for instance, being therapized to accept what has happened in the past so then we can process it. This is not the same as saying you agree with what has happened in the past. You are A-okay with that abuse and neglect. Right? Right. So orientation to experience is about being, I would say, neutral yet tilted towards a kind of positivity as possible. At least not being shut down with negativity, right? If we are negative, if we are hostile, if we are in a neurotic state of mind, that is the antithesis of curiosity, openness, and acceptance. That is living from fear and rejection of experience. Mindfulness is the opposite of all of that, as we are trying to actually, for maybe our first times in human lives, pay attention to what is happening inside of us holistically through and through, and how it's relating to what's happening outside of us without our busy brains making stories about the events that then keep us locked in place. All right, so that is what the psychologists have to say. And let's move into what I've been journaling about that I want to share with you. So, in my world, it's helpful to think about mindfulness in line with metacognition, or simply thoughts about your thoughts and feelings and your values and your authentic identity, right? Having recognition or awareness of what's going on internally, and then really trying to place those events in your own history and in how that history is impacting the way that you are interpreting things modern times, currently, presently. Ideally, you learn to do this in real time, and it allows you to become an observer of your brain and emotions rather than, as we stated in the last Back to Basics episode, believing that you are your brain and emotions, or that they are you. They are part of you. Your experience is heavily related to them, but you get to neutrally observe and then guide them in any direction that's necessary. So this is very related to a subject we've been talking about in the not back to basic episodes recently: type 2 processing and decision making. So we have type 1, kind of immediate, intuitive and instinctual reactions to things. Again, that's where we might put our triggers and other automatic reactions that are often survivally based or somehow wired in us in a very extreme and specific way. And then we have type 2 processing and decision making, which incorporates a higher mind, the ability to reflect and to guide decisions through taking a pause and really applying our best brain cells to what is happening. So this is that orientation towards one's experience that was just discussed in that paper. So again, this is something that is necessary for us to learn to do pretty much continually, unfortunately, which starts out very exhausting, but you will gain proficiency in it over time as you practice and as you get a grip on more and more of your internal events. It's required because you've been so thoroughly trained or conditioned, if you prefer that word, to rapidly and automatically behave. And this is especially true when we come from chaotic, frightening environments. Oftentimes, we did have a particular response or reaction that was required from us in order to not have some really frightening or painful or legitimately survival threatening things take place. And therefore, our brains react very quickly and in rather extreme ways that do not include that higher human mind really taking a good gander at the consequences that might befall us. So, to speak more to this so-called training that happens, which again, controversial term, I understand, but my background is in behavioral science. And I have to say, it was frighteningly eye-opening to just how simply our brains are trained, how manipulated they are, and then how we continue those patterns forever through our relational learning and the structures all around us. So, training or conditioning or being formed into the human that you are today, it happens very easily, very simply, oftentimes very accidentally, through simple, good old punishment and reward. That's it. Just punishment and reward is the basis for pretty much everything that you might hate or love about yourself today. So, let me just clear this up real quickly because it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. Punishment is anything that decreases a behavior taking place again in the future. Reward is anything that increases the occurrence of a behavior taking place in the future. And that's it. So people often misuse the term negative reinforcement and believe that that is actually describing punishment when in fact it is describing a condition where something unpleasant is removed and that increases the likelihood of a behavior down the road. So if your mother is generally up your asshole and around the corner, or if there's usually very strict rules and regulations around your existence, or some other kind of pressure that's stressful and unpleasant, for example, it's the removal of that which serves as a reinforcement, which then makes you behave in line with whatever they were attempting to teach you. Or they may not have been attempting to teach you anything at all, but your experience was one of, oh, if I scream at mom, she removes herself from my sphincter for a while and I get some fucking peace and quiet. You were just accidentally negatively reinforced to scream at mom. You know what I'm saying? All right. Similarly, punishment only counts as punishment if it does actually decrease the occurrence of a behavior down the line. So if your parents took away TV from you as an attempt to punish you for something, but you didn't give a shit about watching TV, that was not an effective punishment, right? Okay. I'll put my behavioral science hat back up on the wall for now. If anyone has questions about that, I'm happy to teach it more directly. Okay. So the point is that training happens through punishment and reward. And that's as complicated as it really gets. Except there are some different instances to describe. Like, number one, sometimes it's a real connection that's made. For instance, if you act emotionally and your parents responded by ignoring you or screaming at you or slapping you, most likely you are making an accurate connection between showing emotions and being punished, right? If those things happen in close proximity to one another, your brain has probably got that one correctly. But number two, sometimes it's a superstitious connection that's made in your head between the behavior and the consequence. Things end up wired together inaccurately, just like they do when some guy wears the same shirt twice in a row and his football team wins. The brain forms a connection that isn't really there. This shirt equals consequence of my team wins. Our brains can do that with our experiences in 1,000,000,001 instances. And then we go on living with this false belief, this superstition about what behavior leads to what result. For instance, if you reveal your hurt feelings to a friend later in your life and you don't hear back from them immediately, you're left in silence. Or maybe a month later, it seems like they're getting kind of distant. You're having a hard time getting them on the phone or making plans with them. The human brain can easily perceive those two events, not hearing back right away, or later on having some kind of separation or change in the relationship, as punishment for being emotional that time you were emotional, right? You can accidentally create a connection that is not really there, which again is teaching you emotions equal some sort of negative result, especially socially, perhaps. And instance number 3, sometimes we go on to create kind of a self-defensive or a flawed logic explanation for something that has happened to us, maybe over a longer duration of time. So kind of similar to the second example that we just went through, there's an event, and then sometime later, the brain is trying to piece together what happened to cause this event. And you end up just kind of picking things out of your timeline that could theoretically, somewhat reasonably be connected. For example, you can't figure out what has happened to this friendship that you had 5 years ago, and it bothers you. The brain has to create a story to settle the matter, because otherwise it will just endlessly try to process, where did that person go? Why is this long-standing mystery still taking place? What happened? How is this possibly my fault? And so therefore you might suddenly remember that time that you got emotional at them at some point in your relationship. And the old noggin, thinking it's so fucking smart, decides, oh, that's what happened. I got emotional and then they left me. So you kind of assert this new story upon yourself, leaving out a lot of other events that you'd probably care not to see that could maybe explain the thing more thoroughly. Like, maybe there were many times that you flaked on them, or you became critical, or you were talking shit behind their back for years while you were friends. Doesn't matter. Your brain has come up with a story, and that has just reinforced this punishment narrative. So, essentially, regardless of how this happens, if it's a real connection, like in instance one, if it's a kind of superstitious connection between two things that did take place, but they weren't really related, or number three, if it's kind of a convenient narration to make the story fade from your memory, does not matter, because these lessons are pulled from our experiences and they're telling us tales about our experiences that we end up solidly wiring together. And that happens more and more the more often we experience them, or the more often we remember them and ruminate on them. AKA, if instance one really does happen, your parents did punish you for acting emotionally or expressing emotion when you were a young child. And then instance two also happens. There was some time in your maybe elementary or middle school or high school days where you had an emotional disclosure towards someone, and for whatever reason, they faded out of your life a bit. So again, you believed it was connected to your emotionality. And then down the road, you create a lot of stories like in instance three, because you've already been primed with this training early in life. Now it seems like anytime a relationship goes down the shitter, your brain automatically comes up with a story or an example of you expressing your emotions and then losing that person in your life. The stories gain traction as they're layered on top of each other, because they begin to create this whole cohesive narrative in your self-autobiography about why emotions inevitably lead to abandonment / some form of punishment, right? It becomes more and more difficult to shake that story because it seems like there's continued evidence for it being correct. And therefore, to get back to my original point, your brain and body are going to react the same way rapidly and automatically to prevent the threat of this punishment. So you may learn to shut down your emotions or to bottle them up or withhold them from others, for instance. Sometimes this becomes hardwired into your brain. It's an automatic reaction. If you have a feeling, you immediately repress or suppress it without even realizing that it's happening. Sometimes it's more of an immediate rule and a reaction to realizing that you are having emotions. There's a secondary fear response that you could observe if you carefully watched. And it's that fear response that makes you recall all of those past instances of punishment or abandonment, and therefore you shut down your feelings. But the point is that it's this original training, that original punishment event that goes on to spawn all manner of maladaptive behaviors down the line, which fuck up your relationships and honestly, the rest of your life. Even your relationship with yourself is going to be pretty well screwed if you do not let yourself have emotions or express them to people. Very quickly, just to define this, maladaptive is being used here because a behavior is maladaptive when it is not actually benefiting you, but you keep repeating it anyways. And that's the real danger here. You learn this lesson early on in life. It is not accurate across all situations, circumstances, times, places, relationships, but you keep automatically applying it to every set of circumstance. And that is where it is no longer adaptive. It's maladaptive because you are reaping negative results, but repeating the same action anyways in a rigid way. And some of those maladaptive behaviors could be things like totally freezing when you have an emotion, or immediately lashing out to try to protect yourself with an expression of anger rather than sadness. If you've learned that sadness was more likely to earn you punishment, but anger perhaps makes your bitch ass mom go away, as I originally described early on in this episode. An emotion might make you isolate. You just withdraw from the human species so they cannot see that you are having an emotion and therefore punish you. Or you might go into self-berating, just really ruminating on the ways that you're shameful for having that emotion, punishing yourself without letting someone else do it for you. Or perhaps you try not to have the emotion by distracting yourself. And this could be via scrolling or turning on the TV or eating, substituting your need for emotional expression with another need, such as consuming food or sleeping. You can just sleep your feelings away, or so we all think. The point is that these patterns are not going to stop on their own. That immediate, initial, original punishment event from your early childhood and the pattern that it has created is going to continue until metacognition, or in real time critical thinking / type 2 processing / being mindful becomes utilized regularly. In this way, you will finally, number one, notice that emotion. Number two, notice the thought about that emotion, or notice the emotion about that emotion. Number three, question the story behind that thought or emotion about your emotion, trying to place it in your history, critically questioning, why the fuck am I thinking or feeling this way? And where did this all come from? Where is this anchored in my history? And how is it maybe an inaccurate lesson, or an accurate lesson that I've been over applying to a lot of situations that I would really benefit from having a bit more flexibility around, right? From putting my attention on it and orienting in an adaptive way rather than this immediate responding, which is called reacting or being triggered, that I've been accidentally repeating time and time again for the past, 20 to 65 years, right? In this way, you, number four, make a conscious decision about how to handle the emotion rather than unconsciously repeating what your stupid fucking brain believes is correct from, I don't know, maybe the time you were 2 to 4 years old. There is a good chance that your life is different. The relationships around you are different. Your ability to have and work through your own emotions is different than it was back then. And you might want to start putting all of that knowledge to work for you if you want to escape this trauma-trapped life that we otherwise end up in. Now, I just want to reiterate that this is especially true for thoughts and stories and behaviors that have been seemingly or actually validated elsewhere with repeat occurrences of this behavior leading to some sort of negative result, or so our brains believe. It does not matter if it is true or not. Once it's wired into your head, it becomes true to you. So, in other words, it goes from a theory when we cried and then dad beat us red in the ass when we were 4 years old, and we presumed that it was our emotional expression that led to the abuse. That turns into an accepted and, quote, proven reality if then down the line our friend seems to disappear because we are emotional, our significant other seems to punish us in so many ways when we express feelings that they're not comfortable with or don't know how to respond to. All of these keep reinforcing that our first lesson taken away from our own experiences was correct. And then it becomes what I like to call a fucked up core belief, or a tenet that we live our life by, that we do not question anymore because it has been so solidly programmed inside of us, that we continue living in the shadow of, without even recognizing that we could question that reality, right? It's this repeat exposure and storytelling, this narration that human brains love to do for explanation purposes, that turns into a real nightmare fairy tale that we then live our lives by. And just like the tendency for our rules that were learned and trained from our parents to infiltrate our friendships and our stories about those friendships, like we previously described, it'll happen in other situations as well. In this particular example, there are infinite sources that tell us that emotions are incorrect or worthy of punishment. For example, school and work and internet culture, all repeating the punishment for emotions exchange, or the narrative that you are weak, or somehow opening yourself up for social danger if you show or express your feelings. So we need to be cautious, as I've said before, of how our family raised us, of how their families raised them, which will probably describe where a lot of our fucked up core beliefs are coming from. It's the same ones that our parents picked up from other dysfunctional people. We also need to watch our broad and narrow cultural identities. What is going on in our environment? Are we in an extremely right-wing kind of culture where, no, crying makes you a pussy and a gay? Or are we in a more liberal place where emotions are more acceptable if they're the right kinds of emotions, right? All of these things matter because, again, these are all the ways that our brain has influenced itself to believe that these are tried and true, unquestionable realities. So, again, we have to recontextualize our accepted lessons by examining the multiplicitous influences that have probably instilled these real or kind of forced logic. Real enough, the connection could be there if we really want it to. Ideas and behaviors. Once you've already been primed that this is reality, it just takes mere suggestion for the human brain to continue believing that that is bulletproof evidence of its original correctness. Once you have a thought, your brain really doesn't like to rethink that thought. It would rather just think in the same direction as that thought and keep strengthening that same line of thinking. Now, to pull this back to the kind of controversial point, where does all of this really involve the phrase training? Where did I get that from? Yeah, it's punishment and it's reward, but again, we could call that conditioning. So why do I opt for the kind of harder, more nefarious sounding term? Well, in my world, in my view, it's because we are purposely taught so many of these life-crippling habits, these repeat automatic behaviors, for the comfort of the people, quote, above us, the people who have control of us or who somehow represent survival to us. They're the authorities in our lives in one way or another. And oftentimes they are punishing and rewarding us in very sneaky ways that they would deny if called out, in order for us to be smaller pains in their asses, right? How many of us were born into families where we were automatically taught that we were burdens, and therefore there were particular rules around how we needed to act that we absorbed explicitly or implicitly from recognizing that, mom and dad scream a lot more or hit us a lot more if we X, Y, or Z. It's best to just stay quiet and really not express ourselves at all. Maybe nobody taught us that directly, but again, these authorities above us had the power to program these traits into us through very subtle means of punishment and reward. So consider this from a child's perspective as you are learning to apply this mindfulness to your own thoughts and emotions and behaviors. If you were a little kid, you literally relied on these people to direct you and keep you safe. And therefore, it literally was a threat to your life if they gave you the cold shoulder or ignored you or sent you to your room for a period of time. And this might start explaining a lot of automatic, rigid behaviors you have that you can't come up with an overt example of abuse around. You must put yourself back in your child mindset to understand how these things were perceived and how punishing or rewarding these micro examples of behaviors or responses to you really could have been. And also consider that other authorities in your life extend beyond your parents. It's going to include your grandparents, your older cousins, your big siblings, your peers at school or in church or at daycare who had some kind of social sway. These all count almost as much as parents and teachers and bosses as far as how they may have influenced your brain to take very grave and sometimes extreme lessons away from the ways that you were responded to, right? The ways that you were trained are often very subtle and nuanced and difficult to understand when you're a grown-up and you recognize that your mother ignoring you for 5 minutes was not the same as your mother leaving you out in the cold in the dead of winter in Wisconsin. But as a child, you may have not understood that. Now, you might also want me to touch upon this point real briefly. Why is it that I chose this example of not being allowed to have emotions or express those emotions? It is because in so many of our families, it's a very common experience that they were not allowed to have emotions, and therefore they were threatened by you having emotions, because that might spark something in them that they never learned how to deal with. They learned that they needed to shut their emotions down, and therefore you must do it as well, or else it is literally being interpreted as a survival risk to them as grown adults who have not examined their past programming and patterning around emotional experiences and their connection to punishment experiences. So because they never got mindful or metacognated or did this work, therefore you were not allowed to have a whole host of experiences yourself. Your emotions may also just be considered inconvenient to your parents or other authority figures because, well, they delay or dissolve your ability to serve them, to be completely useful or practical to them. Emotions get in the way of efficiency and production, which is why they are also not allowed in our capitalistic little business worlds, right? Same thing. They would disrupt the class schedule if you were to be crying at school all the time. So your teachers probably told you that you were not allowed to have emotions in one way or another. So I just want to hit on that point. Why is it that the experience of being forced to shut down or transmute our emotions is such a common one? Because they are such a threat to other humans who have no emotional intelligence, or other humans who do not want you to have emotional intelligence, because it is somehow a thorn in their side, including the fact that through emotional intelligence within your own system, you might actually start pinpointing that people around you are abusive dickheads, and they don't want that to happen. So it's best if they keep you separated from your own internal guidance system by forcing you to have no feelings at all. So all of these things said, therefore, you were trained by these authorities for sometimes, oftentimes, fairly nefarious reasons to do things like leave your body, disassociate instead of having feelings, or use secondary emotions and defense mechanisms so you can kind of self-ignore your feelings and explain them away without actually having them. Or you may have been taught to constantly stay busy so that your feelings can never catch up with you. Or maybe you project them onto external reasons that your internal feelings exist, seeking something outside of yourself necessarily, so that your emotion can kind of be discharged or relieved very quickly without actually paying attention or investigating it. You might find that you are harder towards yourself when you are emotional, that you shut down or shame yourself. You might punish you when you have feelings instead of waiting for someone else to do it for you. Or, as we mentioned, you might seek alternative need fulfillment when you're emotional, realizing that you cannot have the feeling and you cannot express it to others. Instead, you try to comfort yourself with some other human need, like, again, eating or seeking acceptance or comforting yourself in any kind of physical way. So you will have to see and deal with, well, I can't really give you a number, maybe dozens of these patterns and programs that are inside of you that are based on old training programs from your childhood or old lessons learned that seemed very crucial and accurate and important back then. But now, as an adult, you have to do the whole reparenting thing in order to retrain your brain that these are not adaptive behaviors. They are not appropriate in every situation. And these fucked up core beliefs are not accurate for you now or in every set of circumstances. And none of this is possible without metacognitions or mindfulness. Somehow connecting what is going on inside of you to what is going on outside of you and where these often false beliefs were born. So again, I know this sounds exhausting. I know it sounds tedious and like it is outside of anything that you're capable of. But I promise it's not true. You can do this at any point in your life. You are never too old to change a behavior. It really helps, though, to understand where that behavior is coming from. And to do that, you're going to have to get into your own head and revisit probably some painful lessons learned to see how you can reflect and recontextualize them so you can recalibrate your behaviors moving forward. And that is the power of becoming mindful and able to orient yourself towards a particular mindset or approach to life over and over and over again, learning to do it more and more efficiently so that you are in real time the observer of your brain and you do not fall into the trap of believing that you are your stupid fucking brain. All right, y'all. I think that's as much as I have to say from my notes today. If you have questions on any of this, please do pop them down in the comments so I know what to expand upon. And otherwise, thank you for being here. Thank you for believing that it is possible to change. It really is, as much as it takes a new approach to living. Again, I mean, what results were you getting with the old approach? And wouldn't you rather try something new as not to continue beating your head against the same wall forever and wonder why there's a bit of a bump on your noggin? If you're going to be here trying to live and create some sort of purposeful, meaningful, even semi-pleasant existence, you might as well be doing this work of actually understanding what's happening for you inside and outside, instead of living in these trance-like, often inaccurate and extreme trauma dreams that will fill your life if you let them. It doesn't have to be that way. And we're so glad to have you around the community. One of the motherfuckers applying these lessons to real life and showing the rest of the world that it's doable. All right, y'all. You're not alone in this. Reach out if you need any help. Hail yourself and your new set of behaviors as you move forward into a way of living that you actually want. Hail Archie and Marcus Barkus. And until we speak again, cheers, y'all. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.